While Gloucester has traces of relics from ancient Rome, the city was heavily bombed in the Second World War, leaving space for the so-called modern architects of the 1960s and 1970s to put up their aesthetically dubious concrete blocks. However, amid what is generally an uninspiring aesthetic, there are a number of historic gems, particularly from the Tudor period. For those unaware, the Tudor era in England was around the 1500s and encompassed monarchs such as Henry VIII and writers like William Shakespeare. Tudor is the Welsh word for king, and it was the surname of Henry VII. Here is a typical example of the astounding to the downright ugly, all within one street. Before we go full on Tudor, we'll take a look at Gloucester Cathedral, because that provides the background for many of the surrounding historic buildings that we'll see in this video. The history of Gloucester Cathedral is extensive. Here are the Infirmary arches. These are 14th century architectural remnants of the medieval monastic hospital where sick or elderly monks were cared for. These arches were part of a larger complex, much of which has disappeared today, although a private college now occupies some of the old buildings on this site. Identifying a Tudor building is simple. The trademark is the black and white timber, lurching type of structure, although some buildings use colours other than white. You can see very clearly here through the remaining stilts how this is a half-timbered building, which was common in Tudor architecture. This means beams were split in half. The wood is oak, and oak trees were used for just about everything 500 years ago, from warships to houses, and the nearby Forest of Dean lost most of its native oak trees as a result. The oak beams were fixed together with joints and pegs, no nails. Wall panels often comprised wattle and daub or were filled with stone or brick rubble. However, while Tudor buildings could be built to be taller than stone buildings, there was always a risk of a terrible fire taking hold. This Tudor building seems to be an extension on top of an earlier stone building. Look at how remarkably preserved this building is. This is known as the Parliament Rooms. In 1378, King Richard II, who was only 12 at the time, had to move his parliament here from London because of riots in London at the prospect of the introduction of a poll tax. The king and his court occupied most of this site over several days, and records suggest that their presence was a nuisance for those at the Abbey. These were the offices of the person responsible for charitable giving. On behalf of the abbey or cathedral, it distributed clothing and help for the poor. This is a monument to the Royal Hussars. They were a cavalry brigade that formed from that of the Prince of Wales and of Prince Albert. In short, Gloucester Cathedral traces its origins to a small Saxon abbey founded around 600 AD, but the grand structure seen here today began with a Norman rebuild around 1100. Over the following centuries, fires, collapses and changing tastes drove continual transformation, layering Gothic styles onto the original Romanesque core. A turning point came after the burial of Edward II of England, whose tomb attracted pilgrims and funded major 14th century additions. The abbey was dissolved under Henry VIII in the 16th century, but was swiftly refounded as a cathedral, ensuring its survival. comfy Pew Cafe opened a few years ago, although the building dates back to the 14th century. Inside the cafe you can find some original seats, or pews, from the cathedral. This building was the setting for Beatrix Potter's The Tailor of Gloucester. Beatrix Potter was visiting her cousin who lived near to Gloucester, and Beatrix read about a real tailor in Gloucester who reported that some cloth had been cut out overnight, supposedly by fairies. Beatrix came to visit the tailor, who lived on the High Street, and made some sketches of some of the buildings she saw around the cathedral. She chose 9 College Court for her story. Westgate Street is the main shopping street in Gloucester. Some sources suggest the Sword Inn is Gloucester's oldest pub, established in 1680. The part on the left was the actual workplace of the Tailor of Gloucester, who Beatrix Potter was inspired by. It seems there are lots of drinking holes in this area. This one featured the Monks' Retreat. The monks here clearly had times of pleasure. The Fleece Hotel itself has a name reflected in the wool trade that was an economically significant industry in the past. Off Westgate Street, on Northgate Street, is a well-preserved new inn. Originally this was a pilgrim's inn for visitors to the shrine of King Edward II in St. Peter's Abbey, which is now Gloucester Cathedral. Now imagine the many interesting people who once stayed here, a bit like one of those Camino hangouts in Spain, from knights to scholars, pilgrims, as well as less salubrious characters. Minstrels would often play here while people sipped on ale and mead. And here we are back to a moment of ugly. King Square is probably one of the ugliest town squares that I've seen. That said, Wetherspoons occupies a former Art Deco cinema. Let's do a U-turn and go back down Westgate Street to see if we can find any more Tudor masterpieces. The Fountain Inn was believed to have been owned by the bishop who crowned Henry III at the cathedral in 1216. The building was converted into an inn in the 17th century and got its name from the nearby well. On the right here is St. Nicholas Church. It has a leaning tower, but quite simply I didn't notice it. But just before the church is Dick Whittington's, another former inn. However, before it became an inn, it was the residence of Richard Whittington, apparent cousin to the legendary Mayor of London called Dick Whittington. Across the road are some further Tudor buildings. They are currently called the Folk of Gloucester, as they host community events, and these comprise the homes of several former merchants. The interiors have been fully preserved. The green building is referred to as Bishop Hooper's lodging because he stayed here shortly before his execution in 1555. Bishop Hooper was a supporter of Reformation, which backed separation from the Catholic Church. He was sentenced to death for heresy by Queen Mary I. On Southgate Street, with the lattice-like facade, is Robert Raike's house, dating from 1560. Raike was known as the founder of the Sunday School movement. Sunday schools were classes before going to church worship and had a strong Christian focus. Raike took over ownership of the Gloucester Journal, which was started by his father, and in 1758 he moved it into this building. There's an extraordinary unpainted timber facade building here. It was built around 1665 for Thomas Yate, apothecary and mayor of Gloucester. It is believed that it may have been constructed using timber from the Mayflower, the ship used for the Pilgrim Fathers' voyage to America. One more noteworthy landmark in Gloucester city centre is the G.A. Baker & Son jewellery store. It has an iconic Edwardian frontage and a clock that was installed in 1904. It features an automaton that chimes every quarter hour and includes figures of Father Time and the four nations of the UK.